Hello, my name is Brendan O'Connell. I'm your host. Infertility is an age-old problem. Did you know that many women donate, or more accurately, sell their female eggs so that infertile couples can have a child? Why are women doing this? What is the incentive to do so, given a woman has a finite number of eggs during her childbearing years? And are there any risks to selling her eggs? And what about the child who's eventually born? Is it important for him or her to know their biological parents? What if they learned that all you could find out about their biological parents were their height, IQ, race, eye, and hair color? Is it wrong to be left not knowing? Well, today's show examines another important voice and topic in the broad mosaic of the Right to Life movement. I confidently believe you'll find today's show to be unique, informative, content-rich, truthful, and thought-provoking. Today's guest is an international speaker, writer, and filmmaker, combining 25 years of pediatric critical care nursing, senior-level nursing management, and graduate training in bioethics to promote a life-affirming conscience in science, medicine, technology, and public policy. She works with these key influences and decision-makers to change biotechnologies which might undermine human dignity and or expose the vulnerable to abuse when involved with modern-day reproductive technologies. I confidently believe you'll find today's show to be unique, informative, content-rich, truthful, and thought-provoking. Well, welcome, Mrs. Jennifer Lal.
Thank you, Brendan. It's good to be with you.
Mrs. Lal, I don't want to cut you short, but I wanted to show this first trailer that we have so that people have an idea of what we're talking about when we talk about exploitation. Could you please roll the trailer?
And we see young women being looked at as a market for eggs.
If you're tall, attractive, physically fit, and have a desire to help, and what person doesn't want to see themselves that way?
You have to be attractive woman of all ethnicity between the age of 21 and 29. So that's also pretty screwed up, I think.
On top of that, they looked for someone with a very good education. They did an IQ test on me.
Look at this, it's an elite donor. So that means obviously you have to go through a process. They don't want just any egg.
And so I did the math and I figured out that I needed about $3,000. And if I had that $3,000, everything would be fine.
I just very much had the altruistic piece of me triggered.
Everything that happened to me was a chain of events where certain medical risks were not taken into account.
And when he saw my distended abdomen, his face went white.
They really emphasized the fact that backing out was not acceptable. They portrayed it as us betraying them. We were no longer in control at that point.
So I think the whole time I felt like they were trying to get rid of me.
And he looked me in the eye and he said, "Oh, Alexandra, we will try to save your ovary, but you may lose your ovary."
I did make poor decisions as a result of the financial compensation.
And I made a decision to sell my eggs. That affected my ability to reproduce.
I mean, I can't have my own children now.
My story isn't documented in any statistics anywhere.
They become forgotten. They're a faceless person that comes in and donates their eggs, and then they're gone.
Well, Jennifer, how was it that you first decided to do this, and how big is this? How many egg donors are there in the U.S. and worldwide?
Yeah, well, your question is probably easier to answer because the answer to how many actually do this is we don't know. The tagline of the Dirty Little Secrets, and one of the Dirty Little Secrets is that we don't track young women who donate eggs. So there's really no sense of how this is occurring and how global the problem is. How I came to make the movie was I've been writing and speaking in the area of reproductive technology for more than and I just kept meeting young women who had their health significantly harmed in simple ways. Find me through the internet. And so I decided finally to produce Exploitation, which we released in 2010. And we won Best Documentary in the 2011 California Independent Film Festival. We thought that was, wonderful that we won such an honor. And these young women in the film were brave enough to go on camera and tell their story.
Now, what are some of the complications? They were talking about complications they experienced from egg donor donation. I don't know if is that the right word, donation?
Well, there are a few people that actually do donate their eggs, for free, altruistically. But in large numbers, most of the young women that I've met and come across in my writing and speaking have made the decision to sell their eggs. So you're right that we don't really think of it truly in the sense of a donation as one donates a kidney.
And how many women have died from egg donation? Is there any statistics on that?
No, there are no statistics, which is unfortunate because we don't track this. And a lot of times, if a young woman dies from this, we don't necessarily know what the result of the cause of the death was. Similarly, maybe more importantly, is the women that suffer just harm. The majority of women do not die from selling or donating their eggs, but there is a significant number of women, I believe, if we did our studies and our tracking as we should. There are significant numbers of women who actually have short and long-term complications. But again, it's hard to get hard numbers because a young woman might be admitted to a hospital and her admitting diagnosis is abdominal pain or fluid retention. So things that don't say, the reason this young woman is presenting herself in the emergency room is because she sold her eggs, 4 weeks ago or 2 months ago. And we can talk about the risks now if you'd like to.
Yeah. What are the risks? And how many eggs are women born with? How does that work?
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the risks first. And think of, you can put the risks in two categories. There's the short-term risks, and then there's the longer-term risks. The short-term risks are anything that you would imagine the risks of anesthesia and surgery, because a young woman has to undergo a surgical procedure and has to have anesthesia. So there's just those natural risks. There's a risk of any kind of surgery that's bleeding or infections, complications of a surgical procedure. Then in the film, if your viewers end up watching the film and getting a copy of it, which I hope they do, they'll see that there's this risk, a short-term risk of something called ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. And it's a syndrome where a woman's ovaries have been hyperstimulated, sort of like put into overdrive, so they produce 10, 20, 30 eggs at one cycle. And so that is a very real short-term risk. Now, the longer-term risks are related to cancers, reproductive cancers, breast cancers, uterine cancers, and also risks of her own fertility. Like the trailer you just showed, one woman said, I'll never be able to have any of my own children now. So it is a real risk that in the longer term, these young women will lose their ability to have their own children. Their fertility will be damaged.
I see. And I noticed that there was a drug called Lupron, L-U-P-R-O-N. What is that drug and why is it used? And is it of a concern for the woman who's donating her eggs?
Yes, Lupron is pretty commonly used, and I'll call attention, I know it's not a website that you're showing, but there's a woman who actually lives in the Boston area, and she runs a website solely devoted to the drug Lupron called the Lupron Victims Hub. And Lupron, what it does is it causes the young woman to go into a medically induced menopause, so her ovaries basically go to sleep, and that's the first phase of the whole process of a woman donating, selling her eggs, is to put her ovaries asleep using this drug Lupron. And Lupron has what we call Category X rating. Category X drugs means that if you are taking a Category X drug and you get pregnant, your child will be born with birth defects. It's not you might have a child with birth defects. It means your child will most assuredly be born with birth defects. Now, keep in mind, Lupron is used on these egg donor women who are intentionally being made super, super fertile. And they're young women on college campuses who may be sexually active. So I think it's really kind of playing with fire, using a drug that has a Category X rating, especially on a patient population of young women on university campuses who may be sexually active and getting pregnant and having children that have a birth defect.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Oh, look, and how can infertility clinics get away with this? Why is there any government oversight going on here? What's going on?
Yeah, it's amazing that I get asked that question often. There is really very little oversight and regulation in reproductive and fertility medicine. It's a relatively new technology. It's been around about 3 decades, a little more than 3 decades since the birth of Louise Brown, the famous first test tube baby. And because it happened upon the scene as sort of solution to infertility, and everybody just welcoming this brand new technology as a solution to help couples have babies, it's really just grown without a lot of oversight. When you introduced me in my bio, I was a nurse for over 2 decades, and I often ask people, why is it that when egg and sperm leave a patient's body, a person's body, we don't know where it ends up? Unlike any other thing that leaves a patient's body, you donate blood, your blood gets barcoded, it goes into a database, we know where the blood came from, we know where the blood ends up. They take your appendix out in the hospital, they take out your gallbladder, they remove gallstones, they take off a skin biopsy for skin cancer tests. Everything goes into a database, and we know where these things leave. Egg and sperm leave a body, and there's no tracking. There's no follow-up of where this egg came from and where it ends up, where the sperm came from and where it ends up. What happens to these embryos when they're fertilized in the laboratory? It's very unregulated and little oversight. And much of my work is trying to encourage regulation and oversight. And as you can imagine, an industry in America, the size of the fertility industry, that's roughly conservatively $8 billion a year, they're not terribly anxious to be regulated. They really like things the way they are. They like the status quo.
Wow, that's a sizable industry. Now, I was wondering also, how does egg donation differ from sperm donation? Is there a big difference, and do people get paid differently? How much do they get paid when they're donating sperm or donating their eggs?
Absolutely. There's a huge, significant difference. I mean, it's quite onerous on a young woman's body. She undergoes injections. It's about a 4 to 6 week time frame of giving herself daily injections of very strong, powerful drugs. It ends with a surgical procedure and all the things that are entailed in undergoing surgery and anesthesia. Unlike, without being graphic at all, how easy it is to get sperm out of a man's body. And you'll see the difference in pay. A sperm donor might pay $75 or maybe $250 if he has, desirable attributes. Whereas an egg donor, can be paid $6,000, $7,000, $8,000, $10,000, $15,000 and up. It's not uncommon for me to see ads in university papers advertising, $100,000, $50,000 to sell your eggs.
Wow, that's something else. That would, I guess, they incentivize the woman to do it. And of course, when you're in college, you're usually strapped for cash and all that sort of thing.
And, yes, and it totally corrupts medicine because nowhere again in the medical paradigm does money enter in. You're not allowed to be paid to sell your kidneys. You're not allowed to pay to sell, part of your liver. And here you are trying to give informed consent to these young women and telling them about all these potential risks while there's a big chunk of money on the table that they desperately need. And it's really a corruption of medical ethics and medical practice. And it's taking an otherwise young, healthy woman and jeopardizing her health and her future fertility.
Wow. Now, you gave an example of a couple that had given had a surrogate mother and had a child, a boy, by them, and then they had the same surrogate mother get pregnant again. Could you tell what happened there?
Yeah, it's a true story, and it really, I think, it illustrates well how global and how deep and complex these problems are, and how woefully unregulated this practice is. And it was a story of a couple that was having trouble with their own fertility. So they opted to use a young woman who had agreed to be a paid surrogate. They used another woman who agreed to sell her eggs, and they eventually had a child. And then this couple went back to the surrogate and the egg donor later on, a few years later, because they wanted a sibling for the child. And the young surrogate found out that she was pregnant with twins. And this time she was pregnant with twin girls, and the first pregnancy was a little boy. The couple said they didn't want twins and they didn't want girls, so they told her that she needed to terminate the pregnancy, which she wasn't willing to do. So she was sort of left in a predicament where she had to find a couple or somebody that was willing to adopt these little girls when they were born. And she eventually did find, through the internet, a lesbian couple in the San Francisco Bay Area who adopted the children. And then the lesbian couple separated and split up, and each one of those lesbian women took one of the babies. So, at the end of the day, there's not a lot of forethought on what's the best interest of these children. And here were, an egg donor, a surrogate, a man and a woman, two lesbians, all these people, all these adults with their competing interests, their competing needs and desires and rights. And, ultimately what happened? The children ended up being raised by strangers.
Oh, wow, that's really something. And what about the sperm donor? Did he have any legal recourse in this situation?
In this situation, it was just an anonymous sperm donor, which is very common. Anonymous egg and sperm donation is very common. The couples, I often refer to them as the commissioning couples, the intended parents, the people that are buying, really want anonymity. They want to pretend and have this sort of illusion that this is their child, which, eventually we'll be talking about my next film, which I know you'll show the clip of, and it really does look at, are the children all right that are created in these really 21st century brave new world, I call it brave new scary world kind of scenarios. It's quite tragic.
I see. Well, now let me ask you, what percentage of in vitro fertilization treatments succeed, and what percentage fail?
There is a huge, huge failure rate. The one place where we do get a little bit of data and tracking comes from the CDC. People can go to the cdc.gov website and look. And if you look at the data that's presented to the CDC and put out in their reports, it's about 70% failure rate of IVF cycles. So it's a very high failure rate, which gets back to why do we create so many embryos in the laboratory? Why do we have so many surplus frozen, embryos in cold storage? Is because we know it's a largely failed enterprise. For people that are concerned about women's health, people who are concerned about the well-being of children, for people who are concerned about being consistently pro-life, I'm always telling people that IVF doesn't meet any of those litmus tests. It's harmful to women, it's dangerous to children, and it's certainly not a pro-life enterprise.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you a little bit about just ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. Why is that so dangerous for a woman?
Yes. Well, you can imagine if you think about how a woman's body is naturally to operate, a woman will naturally release one egg a month. Occasionally, she'll release 2 eggs, which is how you naturally see twinning happening in nature. When you put women on these drugs, and remember, keep in mind the egg donor's being paid to produce eggs, and they want a lot of eggs because if you're going to pay $10,000 or $20,000 or $30,000, you don't want 1 egg or 2 eggs. So they will aggressively stimulate the young woman's ovaries to produce many, many eggs in one cycle. And so think about an ovary that's relatively small in a woman's body being put into hyperdrive so that it can spit out, 20 eggs. So the ovaries get really big. And you can talk to these women, and they talk about their bellies being so distended that they almost look and feel like they're pregnant. One woman said when she would roll over and turn over side to side in her bed at night, she could feel her ovaries kind of like sloshing around. There's so much fluid. There's so much swelling. And all this fluid and swelling puts pressure on not only the ovaries, but all other organs. There's one documented article in the medical literature infertile women who take these drugs too, not just the egg donor, but infertile women take these drugs to use their own eggs. And this particular journal article reported on stroke. And you can imagine when you have so much extra fluid that you are at risk for stroke and for blood clots. One of the women in exploitation had a torsion ovary where the ovary got basically strangled in the fallopian tube because there was so much ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. So there's documented risk of kidney failure because of all the harm done and the strain done to the kidneys during this aggressive stimulation phase. And it's appalling to me, as somebody who worked as a nurse for 25 years, that we're taking a young, healthy woman and putting her body through this. And as a woman, I often say to other women, do we really want to ask young women to do this for us? And really challenge. I understand the heartbreak of infertility, the heartbreak of the barren womb. I understand the desire to have children. Those are all good desires. But do we want to, trade one woman's health and well-being for our desire to have a child?
I see. Well, how can we legislate the profit out of this donation process? Or how could we resolve or stop this from happening?
Yes, I think on the exploitation website, we actually have sample model legislation. One is to be like our neighbors in Canada. You cannot pay for egg or sperm in Canada because this is largely, money-driven, big profit. Part of the work that I do is removing money out of it because I think that will decrease the market, if you will, for eggs and sperm if we just don't pay for it anymore. One thing that can be done is to demand the tracking and the follow-up and the studies to be done. I liken this to the early days with tobacco smoke. And, people were just smoking and smoking and smoking. And it wasn't until we saw people becoming sick and we saw increases in lung cancer did we finally demand studies to be done so that we could now put warning labels on cigarettes saying, danger, this can cause lung cancer. So we need to demand the studies and the tracking that should be done. We need to remove the anonymity out of it because I think, well, for one, I'm against the practice in general, but at a public policy level, I do think the children created through these technologies have right to know who their genetic mothers and fathers are. Well, and so that would require that cannot do this anonymously anymore.
I see.
Those are some simple steps to take.
I see. Well, Jennifer, that's a perfect segue for our next trailer, which has to do with anonymous fathers. And could we play that trailer now, please?
I want to find my biological father because he is an important part of my life. I wouldn't be here without him. I want to look in his face, or at least look at a picture of him, and I know that I'm going to see myself. I look in the mirror and I don't know who I look like.
Secrets are like landmines, they can go off at any time.
2/3 of young people who are conceived through sperm donation believe they have the right to know who their fathers are.
Until I was 20 years old, the only thing I knew about my biological father was that he was blonde with blue eyes and he had a college degree.
My sister and I set out on a quest to see if we could find anything more about the man who made us and the 500 or 1,000 half-siblings that I have.
There's definitely an element of baby buying, baby selling.
I have seen the effects on young people who realize that they are the result of a commodification.
His donor number is 81, and that's basically all I know about him.
Nobody has the right to withhold significant personal information about a person from that person.
There really is a growing community of people who are making their voices heard, and they're angry about what's been done to them, and they want to stop it for future generations.
If we're going to have these technologies, then they need to work first and foremost for the people that they directly affect, the children who are being born.
I thought, wow, I'm one of the first produced by science and not sex.
Should we be conceiving children in the first place who will be deliberately denied the ability to know and be known by their father?
It's quite possible to be grateful for your life and question aspects of your conception.
I want to know that story. I want my children to know where they came from. And if I don't find him, it won't be because I didn't look for him.
I tried to give away my child.
Well, Jennifer, just if you could make a quick comment on that. Unfortunately, we're running out of time on that video. What stands?
Yes,
Go ahead.
Well, I want your listeners to know that these are real people who have intentionally been created to not know who in this case, their father is. A lot of times when I speak and I show the film at public screenings, people will say, well, this is just kind of like adoption. And, adopted kids sometimes don't have the luxury of knowing, who their mothers and fathers are. And I say, no, because nobody gets pregnant and says, I'm going to get pregnant so I can give away a child for adoption. Adoption is oftentimes a necessary solution to a situation that we don't intend to set out. Unlike the use of these technologies, we are intentionally setting up a scenario where children won't be connected in any way, or even sometimes they're not even told that their father raising them in their home is not their biological father. I'll be in Kansas next week testifying in a Senate hearing on an interesting case there. Again, it's a situation where a lesbian couple used a sperm donor to create a child. Then the lesbian couple separated. The one lesbian mother who kept the child fell on hard times, and she filed for welfare and financial benefits to provide for the child. And, the state of Kansas said, well, where's the father? And they said, well, he was a sperm donor. He's not responsible. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens with this case in Kansas, because Kansas is basically saying, well, do we want to let this guy off scot-free? And doesn't he have an obligation to his child? So I think these are real-life problems that we have because this technology has just been forged ahead without any reflective, thought, without any policy developed around it. And what we're seeing is children who are now growing up and saying, it's not okay with me that you did this.
Well, Jennifer, unfortunately our time has come to an end, and all I can think of is, what a tangled web we weave. In closing, we hope you learned another perspective from the broad mosaic of the Right to Life movement, the exploitation of a woman's fertility by harvesting her eggs, and the not knowing of one's father is both troubling and fraught with very real and unforeseen problems. We're confident if people know the truth about exploitation, and they will ultimately change their hearts and minds about all that is involved in modern-day medical manipulation for the egg donor, for the unknown fatherless child, and for infertile couples. Thanks for watching. I'm Brendan O'Connell, your friend for life.